The rockets began to sing before dawn. 60 hollow tubes above the tank's turret trembled, and then the air split apart, a rolling thunder that clawed at the sky. In that moment, the men inside the Sherman forgot they were soldiers. They were operators of something older, something primal, a machine that didn't just fire weapons but screamed them into being. The Germans called it the organ of terror. The Americans called it the Calliope. And on that French morning in the summer of 1944, as the launcher ignited and the world turned to smoke and hellfire, every man within a mile knew that war had learned to howl. The sound was impossible to describe afterward. Some tankers said it was like a freight train being torn apart in midair. Others swore it resembled the shriek of a wounded animal amplified 1,000 times. One loader from Pennsylvania compared it to the sound of God clearing his throat before passing judgment. But all of them agreed on one thing. When the Calliope fired, you felt it in your bones before you heard it with your ears. The rockets didn't whistle, they wailed. They didn't launch, they erupted. And in the terrible mathematics of war, where terror could be as valuable as accuracy, the Calliope had found its purpose before its first rocket ever found its target. The story began not with tanks or rockets but with desperation. By the winter of 1943, Allied planners sat in rooms thick with cigarette smoke and studied maps that told stories of failure. The Italian campaign had become a grinding nightmare of stone and blood. Every German bunker was a fortress. Every hillside was a grave. The Wehrmacht had learned to dig in, to fortify, to turn earth and concrete into instruments of delay. Machine gun nests could hold up an entire battalion. A single well-placed pillbox could bleed a company white. The Allies had men, they had tanks, they had artillery, but what they needed was something that could saturate an area with fire so intense, so overwhelming, that defenders would break before they were broken. They needed a weapon that didn't kill with precision but with presence, that didn't aim at soldiers but at their will to fight. Rocket artillery wasn't new. The Soviets had already fielded their Katyusha, a truck-mounted monstrosity that turned the sky into a sheet of flame. The Germans themselves had used Nebelwerfers, rocket launchers that made sounds like the damned crying out from hell. But the Americans wanted something different. They wanted mobility married to armor. They wanted a tank that could fight like a tank but scream like the end of the world. They wanted the Calliope, though they didn't know it yet. The man who gave it form was Colonel John Michelson, an artillery officer whose mind worked in angles and trajectories. He had seen the British experiments with rocket launchers mounted on trucks, had watched the Soviet newsreels of Katyushas turning German positions into moonscapes, and he understood something fundamental. That in modern warfare, the psychological effect of a weapon could matter as much as its destructive power. A single artillery shell could kill a squad. A barrage of 60 rockets arriving simultaneously could break an entire company's nerve. It wasn't about accuracy. Rockets were notoriously inaccurate. It was about saturation, about filling a piece of earth with so much steel and explosive that nothing living could stand inside it. The challenge was mounting. Trucks were vulnerable, easy to knock out with a single shell or air attack. But tanks were armored, mobile, able to advance with the infantry and survive the return fire. The M4 Sherman was already the workhorse of the American armored force, reliable if not invincible, present in numbers that would make any weapon modification immediately practical. So the question became, could you turn a Sherman into a rocket launcher without destroying its ability to fight as a tank? The answer came in the form of a frame. A simple steel structure, really a rectangular launcher rack that sat above the turret like a crown of iron. 60 tubes, arranged in rows, each one designed to hold a 4.5-inch M8 rocket. The entire assembly weighed nearly 2,000 pounds, an ungainly addition that made the Sherman look like it was wearing a pipe organ on its back. The comparison was immediate and obvious, and someone, history doesn't record who, mentioned the Calliopes that used to steam down the Mississippi River, those ornate organs mounted on paddle wheelers that announced the arrival of showboats with music that could be heard for miles. The name stuck, the T-34 Calliope, the rocket tank, the steel musician of death. The engineering was crude but clever. The launcher was connected to the tank's main gun elevation mechanism, meaning that when the gunner adjusted the cannon's angle, the rocket rack moved with it. Firing was accomplished through an electrical system that ran cables through the commander's hatch and into the turret, where a simple switch could trigger the ignition sequence. The rockets themselves were standard Army ordnance, high-explosive warheads designed to be fired from ground-based launchers, now adapted for mobile warfare. Each one measured nearly 3 feet long and could travel up to 4,000 yards, though accuracy beyond 1,000 yards was more prayer than science. The first test firing took place in early 1944 at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, and the witnesses would later describe it in tones usually reserved for religious experiences or natural disasters. The Sherman rolled to a stop on the range, its turret swiveling to bring the massive rack to bear on a distant hillside marked with targets. Inside the tank, the crew went through their checklist with the methodical calm of men who had no idea what they were about to unleash. The electrical connections were checked. The safety was removed. The commander's hand hovered over the firing switch, and then he pressed it. What happened next defied expectation. The rockets didn't fire in sequence. They erupted almost simultaneously, a cascading ignition that turned the air above the tank into a corridor of flame and smoke. The sound was beyond description, a sustained roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The backblast created a cloud that engulfed the Sherman entirely, and for several seconds the observers lost sight of the vehicle in the smoke. The rockets streaked away, not in neat trajectories but in a spreading cone of destruction, each one trailing white exhaust as it clawed toward the target area. They hit the hillside in a rolling pattern of explosions, tearing up earth and shredding the wooden targets, creating a carpet of devastation perhaps 200 yards wide. When the smoke cleared, the Sherman sat unchanged, its crew shaken but unharmed, the launcher empty and steaming. The observers approached slowly, half expecting to find the tank damaged or the crew deafened. But the Calliope had survived its own fury. The frame was intact. The turret could still traverse. The main gun could still fire. They had created something that worked, something terrible and effective and utterly unlike anything in the American arsenal. Production began immediately, though production was perhaps too generous a term. The Calliope was never mass-produced in the way the Sherman itself was. Instead, launchers were manufactured and shipped to field units, where they were fitted to existing tanks by mechanics who learned the installation process through trial and error. The entire assembly could be bolted on or removed in a few hours, which meant a tank could become a Calliope when needed and return to normal operations afterward. This flexibility was deliberate. The launcher's weight and bulk made the tank top-heavy and slower to traverse, and the massive frame blocked the commander's vision, forcing him to rely on the periscopes that reduced his battlefield awareness to narrow slits of light. The first Calliopes arrived in France shortly after D-Day, shipped across the Channel in pieces and assembled behind the lines while the battle for Normandy ground forward through hedgerows and mud. The crews who received them were a mixture of excited and terrified. Tankers were already gambling their lives every time they rolled into combat. The Sherman's armor was thin by German standards, and the Panther and Tiger tanks could kill them from ranges where return fire was impossible. Now they were being asked to operate a vehicle that announced its presence with a sound like the sky tearing open, that couldn't retreat quickly because of the weight and awkwardness of the launcher, and that required them to expose themselves to enemy fire while preparing the electrical firing system. But when they fired it for the first time in anger, when they pressed that switch and felt the tank shudder as 60 rockets leaped into the air, all doubts evaporated. The Calliope wasn't a precision weapon. It was a statement. It was an announcement that said, everything in that direction is about to cease existing as a coherent military formation. The first combat deployment came during the push toward Saint-Lô, that devastated French city that had become a fortress of rubble and German determination. American infantry had been dying in the hedgerows for weeks, grinding forward one field at a time against an enemy that turned every stone wall and sunken lane into a killing ground. The Calliopes rolled up behind the assault elements just before dawn, their crews nervous, their commanders unsure of what to expect. The target was a German strongpoint, a cluster of buildings at a crossroads where machine guns and mortars had been breaking up American attacks for 3 days. The Sherman stopped at the edge of a field, perhaps 600 yards from the target. The crew could see the buildings through the morning haze, could see the blackened windows where the machine guns nested, could imagine the German soldiers inside preparing for another day of killing. The commander gave the order. The gunner elevated the launcher. Someone in the infantry lines shouted a warning, and the American soldiers pressed themselves into whatever cover they could find, knowing what was coming but unprepared for the reality of it. The Calliope spoke. 60 rockets erupted from the tubes in a sequence so rapid it sounded like a single sustained explosion. The Sherman disappeared into a cloud of white smoke and fire, and the rockets streaked across the field in a spreading pattern that seemed to fill the entire sky. They hit the buildings in a rolling wave of explosions, one after another, overlapping until the individual detonations merged into a continuous roar. Windows shattered. Walls collapsed. Roof beams exploded into splinters. The machine gun positions simply ceased to exist, buried under a deluge of high explosive that didn't discriminate between steel and flesh and stone. When the smoke cleared, the buildings were ruins. The German strongpoint had been transformed into a crater-pocked wasteland in less than 10 seconds. The American infantry, still pressed into their cover, looked at each other with expressions that mixed awe and horror. Someone started laughing, a high nervous sound that spread through the ranks like contagion. They had just witnessed something new in warfare. Not a bombardment, not an artillery strike, but an instant apocalypse delivered by a single tank. The German survivors stumbled out of the rubble with their hands raised, their faces blank with shock. Later, interrogators would learn that the defenders hadn't understood what had happened. They had heard an impossible sound, seen the sky fill with streaks of fire, and then been buried in explosions so dense and rapid that thought became impossible. Some had been killed, others had been wounded, but all of them had broken, their will to resist shattered by an attack that felt less like combat and more like divine retribution. Word spread quickly on both sides. The Americans began requesting Calliope support wherever possible, understanding that the weapon's psychological effect could be worth more than a dozen artillery batteries. The Germans began reporting encounters with a new American terror weapon, a tank that carried rocket artillery on its back, that could fire an entire barrage in seconds and then drive away before counter-battery fire could respond. Intelligence officers tried to gather details, to understand the weapon's capabilities and limitations, but the reports were confused and contradictory. Some said the tank carried 50 rockets. Others claimed 100. A few swore the rockets came in waves, that the tank could fire multiple times in succession without reloading. The truth was both simpler and more limited. The Calliope could only fire once before needing to reload, a process that required removing the spent launcher and installing a new one loaded with fresh rockets. Essentially impossible in combat. This meant that each Calliope was a single-use weapon in any given engagement, powerful but ultimately a one-shot tool. American tactical doctrine adapted accordingly. The Calliopes would be held back from the initial assault, brought forward only when a particularly stubborn strongpoint needed to be obliterated, their rockets serving as a precision instrument of mass destruction. The crews learned to work with the weapon's peculiarities. The launcher couldn't be reloaded under fire, so they treated each mission as expendable, accepting that once they fired, they became just another Sherman until they could return to base. The rockets themselves proved inconsistent. Some would fire perfectly, arcing away toward the target in clean trajectories. Others would hang in their tubes for a split second before igniting, creating erratic flight paths that sent them cartwheeling off target. A few would fail to ignite at all, dead weight that had to be carefully removed later by nervous ordnance teams who knew they were handling live explosives. But the weapon's imperfections mattered less than its impact. Throughout the late summer of 1944, as the Allied armies broke out of Normandy and began the pursuit across France, the Calliopes became instruments of breakthrough. When resistance stiffened, when German defenders dug in at a river crossing or held a town against armored assault, the call would go out for the rocket tanks. They would roll forward through their own lines, their crews calm with the terrible certainty of what they carried, and then they would stop and fire and transform a piece of earth into hell. At the Siegfried line, that massive fortification network that marked Germany's western border, the Calliopes found their perfect target. The German bunkers were thick-walled concrete monsters, designed to withstand conventional artillery, proof against all but the heaviest direct hits. But they hadn't been designed to withstand 60 rockets arriving simultaneously, cratering the ground around them, burying embrasures in debris, turning the approaches into lunar landscapes where no infantry could advance and no tank could find solid ground. The Calliopes didn't destroy the bunkers, they isolated them, cut them off, made them irrelevant by destroying everything around them until the defenders either surrendered or starved. The psychological effect grew with each engagement. German soldiers learned to recognize the sound of a Calliope preparing to fire, the sudden rumble of the Sherman's engine as it positioned itself, the electric whine of the elevation mechanism, the terrible silence that preceded ignition. Those who heard it and survived spread stories that grew in the telling. The rockets didn't just explode, they pursued men through trenches. The tank didn't just fire, it chose its victims with malicious intelligence. The Americans had created a weapon that killed not just bodies but hope itself. But the crews inside the tanks knew a different truth. They knew the Calliope was as dangerous to operate as it was to face. The launcher blocked the commander's hatch, forcing him to remain sealed inside the turret during combat, unable to see the battlefield except through periscopes. The electrical firing system was temperamental, prone to failures that left rockets unfired or created misfires that could detonate warheads inside their tubes. The weight of the launcher made the Sherman handle like a drunk elephant, slow to turn, sluggish to accelerate, a target for any German tank or anti-tank gun that spotted it before it could fire. One crew from the 2nd Armored Division learned this lesson outside Aachen in October 1944. Their Calliope had been ordered forward to support an assault on a German position dug into the ruins of a factory complex. They approached carefully, using rubble for cover, their gunner searching for a firing position that would give them clear sight to the target. But a German Panther had anticipated them, positioned in a side street where its long 75mm gun could command the approach. The Panther fired first. The shell hit the Calliope's launcher frame dead center, detonating several rockets in their tubes. The resulting explosion was spectacular and brief, a cascade of fire that consumed the launcher and turned the Sherman into a torch. The crew escaped through the emergency hatches, their uniforms smoldering, their hearing gone, their faces blackened by smoke. When they reached friendly lines, they refused to ever crew a Calliope again. Some nightmares weren't worth the utility of any weapon. Yet other crews embraced the beast. A sergeant from Ohio named William Chen became known throughout his battalion as the Calliope specialist, volunteering for every mission that required the rocket tank. He understood its quirks, had memorized the electrical system's peculiarities, could judge distances and trajectories with an intuition that bordered on supernatural. His crew learned to trust his instincts, following his commands even when they seemed suicidal. On 17 separate occasions, Chen's Calliope fired into German positions, and on 17 occasions the enemy resistance collapsed. He painted musical notes on his launcher tubes and named his tank the River Organ, explaining to anyone who asked that death should announce itself with proper fanfare. Chen's luck held until the Ardennes, until the winter of 1944, when the Germans launched their final desperate offensive through the Belgian forests and caught the American army by surprise. His battalion had been rushed north to help stem the breakthrough. Their Calliope included despite the terrible conditions: snow, ice, forests that made maneuver nearly impossible. They set up near Bastogne, their tank hidden in a tree line, waiting for German armor that intelligence said was coming. The attack came at dawn on the 3rd day, a column of Panthers and infantry advancing through the snow-covered fields. Chen's crew had spent the night inside their frozen tank, huddled against each other for warmth, their breath forming ice on the interior walls. When the Germans appeared, Chen ordered his driver forward, positioning the Calliope at the edge of the woods where they could fire down the length of the column. It was a perfect ambush position if the rockets fired, if the electrical system hadn't frozen overnight, if the propellant hadn't been damaged by the cold. Chen pressed the firing switch and felt the tank shudder. The rockets ignited, but slowly, sequentially rather than simultaneously, creating a ripple effect that sent them out in groups of 5 or 6 rather than in a single overwhelming volley. It still worked. The first group hit the lead Panther, their explosions walking up the side of the tank and detonating its ammunition. The second group cratered the road, throwing up geysers of earth and snow that swallowed the following infantry. The third group overshot, sailing past the column and exploding in the trees beyond. But by the time the 60th rocket had fired, the German attack had stalled, their vehicles trying to maneuver around the destroyed Panther, their infantry diving for cover in snow that offered no protection. Chen's crew didn't wait to see the results. The doctrine was clear: fire and displace. They backed the Sherman into the forest and retreated through paths they'd scouted the previous night, leaving the launcher behind as per regulations once its rockets were expended. They survived the Ardennes. They survived the Rhine crossing. Chen survived to see Germany surrender and returned home to Ohio with a Bronze Star and a recurring nightmare where he heard rockets igniting but couldn't remember where his tank was positioned, couldn't see through the smoke, couldn't escape the sound of his own weapon's roar. The Calliope faded as the war faded. By the spring of 1945, as Allied armies drove deep into Germany against collapsing resistance, the need for such weapons diminished. The German army was breaking, its defenders surrendering in masses, its fortifications abandoned rather than defended to the last. The Calliopes were withdrawn from frontline service, their launchers removed and stored, their crews relieved to return to normal tank operations. In the final accounting, perhaps 800 launchers were produced, fitted to tanks throughout the European theater. They had fired their rockets in dozens of engagements, killed uncounted German soldiers, broken countless defensive positions. But they had never become standard equipment, never achieved the prominence of the Sherman itself or the artillery that supported it. After the war, military analysts studied the Calliope's record and found it wanting. The rockets were inaccurate. The launcher made the tank vulnerable. The single-use limitation reduced tactical flexibility. Better systems existed: the conventional rocket artillery that could fire multiple salvos, the improved aircraft ordnance that could deliver similar devastation with greater precision. The Calliope was filed away as an interesting experiment, a weapon born of specific circumstances that had outlived its usefulness once those circumstances changed. But the veterans who had served on Calliope crews or fought alongside them carried different assessments. They remembered not the technical specifications but the moments of transformation, the instance when a battlefield situation changed completely because 60 rockets had filled the air with thunder. They remembered the sound more than anything else, that impossible noise that made you duck even when you knew the rockets were outgoing, that stayed in your ears for hours afterward like tinnitus made audible. They remembered the way German prisoners looked at the Calliopes with expressions mixing fear and fascination, as if they'd been defeated not by men but by machines that embodied some fundamental aspect of American industrial might. In the decades that followed, the Calliope's legacy lived on in ways its creators never anticipated. The concept of rocket artillery mounted on armored vehicles became standard doctrine in armies worldwide. The Soviets developed their BM-21 Grad, a truck-mounted system that could saturate square kilometers with rockets. The Americans fielded the M270 multiple launch rocket system, a tracked vehicle that combined armor, mobility, and precision-guided rockets in a package that made the Calliope look primitive. Modern militaries accepted as fundamental truth what the Calliope had demonstrated in France and Germany: that mobile rocket artillery could deliver tactical shock at critical moments, that the psychological effect of massed rocket fire could break enemy formations before the explosives even arrived, that there was value in weapons that screamed as well as destroyed. The few surviving Calliopes became museum pieces, their launcher tubes empty, their electrical systems disconnected, their steel frames rusting gently under protective roofs. Veterans would occasionally visit, standing before the displays with hands in pockets and far-off expressions, remembering summers when the weapon had been new and terrifying, when its roar had meant salvation for American infantry and doom for German defenders. They would read the plaques that explained the technical specifications and tactical doctrine, and they would shake their heads because the words couldn't capture what it had actually been like. The vibration in your teeth when the rockets fired, the smell of propellant mixing with cordite and burned metal, the terrible satisfaction of watching an enemy position simply cease to exist. One such veteran, a former loader named Jack Morrison who had crewed a Calliope through France and into Germany, wrote in his memoir about the moral complexity of the weapon. He described the first time they fired at a German position and watched through binoculars as the rockets arrived, as men were thrown through the air by explosions, as a building collapsed on soldiers trying to escape. He wrote about feeling simultaneously proud of the weapon's effectiveness and nauseated by what it did to human bodies. He wrote about the cognitive dissonance of being a killer and a liberator, of operating a machine designed solely to maximize destruction while believing absolutely in the righteousness of his cause. War simplified many things, he wrote, but the Calliope had complicated them. It was too effective, too overwhelming, too much like playing God with a firing switch. But Morrison also wrote about the lives saved. The German strongpoint his Calliope destroyed would have cost dozens of American casualties in a conventional assault. The bunker positions they saturated at the Siegfried line would have bled companies white in frontal attacks. The terror the weapon inspired shortened engagements, caused surrenders that might otherwise have turned into last-stand bloodbaths. In the brutal arithmetic of warfare, the Calliope had been cost-effective not just in resources but in lives, even if those lives were American rather than German. Morrison struggled with this, spent decades trying to reconcile the violence he had inflicted with the peace he had helped create, and ultimately came to an uneasy acceptance. The Calliope had been necessary. It had been horrible. Both things were true simultaneously, and no amount of philosophizing could separate them. The technical documentation survived in archives, detailed reports on the launcher's performance, engineering schematics, maintenance manuals that explained how to install and remove the frame, troubleshooting guides for the electrical system. Future weapons designers studied these documents, extracting lessons about mounting systems, about rocket stability, about the challenges of integrating projectile weapons onto moving platforms. The Calliope's solutions became stepping stones to better systems, its failures informing future successes. In this way, the weapon continued to serve long after its rockets had fired, its influence spreading through military technology like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Historians writing about the weapon decades later struggled to place it in proper context. It wasn't significant enough to merit extensive coverage in general histories of the war. No battles were decided solely by Calliope fire, no strategic objectives achieved exclusively through rocket saturation. But it wasn't insignificant enough to ignore completely, its psychological impact too well documented, its tactical utility too clear in specific circumstances. So the Calliope appeared in footnotes and specialized studies, in technical histories of armor development and tactical analyses of assault techniques. It became a historical curiosity, interesting but not essential, innovative but not revolutionary. Yet the sound lingered, that impossible howl, that mechanical scream that had terrified German soldiers and awed American ones, existed now only in memory and occasional recordings. Audio engineers who analyzed the sound expressed fascination at its complexity, the overlapping rocket ignitions creating harmonic interference patterns, the Doppler effect as projectiles accelerated away from the launcher, the subsonic rumble of the backblast mixing with the supersonic crack of the rocket's flight. It was, they noted, a sound engineered accidentally, a byproduct of function that achieved an effect beyond its designer's intentions. The Calliope had been designed to deliver explosives. That it also delivered terror was almost an afterthought, though ultimately perhaps its most important feature. In modern warfare, where precision has become paramount and collateral damage minimized, the Calliope's philosophy seems almost barbaric. Saturation fire, area weapons, psychological attacks through overwhelming volume. These concepts persist but under stricter constraints, with greater attention to limiting harm to non-combatants. Yet military analysts still study the weapon when examining the role of shock in combat, when considering how to break enemy formations quickly, when calculating the value of morale effects versus physical destruction. The Calliope's lessons remain relevant even if its specific approach has been superseded by technology and doctrine that emphasize precision over saturation. The men who built the Calliope are mostly gone now, their engineering innovations forgotten outside specialist circles, their names absent from the famous roster of World War II weapons designers. Colonel Michelson, who conceived the idea of mounting rocket artillery on tanks, died quietly in 1974, his obituary mentioning his military service but not his most famous creation. The machinists and welders who fabricated the launcher frames, the electricians who designed the firing systems, the ordnance specialists who adapted the M8 rockets for tank mounting, all have faded into historical obscurity, their contributions known only to those who dig deep into archive documents and technical reports. But their creation achieved a form of immortality through replication. Every modern rocket artillery system owes something to the Calliope's example. Every multiple launch rocket system carries forward the principle that the Calliope proved. That mobile platforms can deliver massed rocket fire, that armor and firepower can be combined in single vehicles, that there is tactical value in weapons that emphasize volume over precision. The specific mechanism has changed. Computerized fire control replaces manual switches. Guided rockets replace ballistic trajectories. Sophisticated launchers replace welded steel tubes, but the fundamental concept persists. The Calliope was crude, but it was first, and being first matters in technology as in war. Perhaps the truest measure of the Calliope's significance lies not in battle reports or technical assessments, but in the nightmares it inspired. German veterans who survived rocket attacks carried memories of that sound for the rest of their lives, would flinch at loud noises decades after the war ended, would wake sweating from dreams where the sky filled with fire and nowhere offered safety. Their testimony, collected by historians and oral history projects, reveals the weapon's true nature. Not just a rocket launcher, but an instrument of psychological warfare, a device that attacked the mind as much as the body. In an era when armies had grown callous to conventional artillery, when soldiers learned to endure bombardment with grim fatalism, the Calliope had found new ways to inspire terror. Its innovation wasn't technological but emotional. It made war personal again, made each soldier feel individually targeted by an enemy with unlimited ammunition and malicious intent. The American crews who operated Calliopes carried different burdens. They had wielded enormous destructive power, pressed a switch and watched landscapes transform into craters, known with absolute certainty that their actions had killed men who moments before had been alive and thinking and perhaps dreaming of home. Some embraced this power, found satisfaction in their effectiveness, took pride in missions accomplished and comrades saved. Others withdrew into themselves, became quiet men who didn't discuss their service, who kept their medals in drawers and their memories locked away. Both responses were valid. Both reflected the impossible contradictions of being a soldier in an industrial war where individual actions could have mass consequences. As the years passed and World War II receded from living memory into history, the Calliope story became part of the larger narrative of American innovation under pressure. Here was a nation that, when faced with tactical problems, responded not with doctrine but with invention, that turned factories and workshops into problem-solving engines, that fielded weird experimental weapons alongside standardized equipment and judged them solely on effectiveness. The Calliope embodied this approach, improvised, awkward, brilliant in its simplicity, effective enough to justify its existence even if it never achieved perfection. It was American in both its conception and its execution, a weapon that valued pragmatism over elegance, that chose immediate solutions over perfect ones, that understood wars are won by fighting them rather than planning them. The tank itself, stripped of its launcher and returned to conventional service, disappeared into the mass of Sherman variants that filled the post-war surplus yards and eventually foreign militaries. Some ended up in South American armies, others in Asian conflicts, a few in Middle Eastern wars decades after their construction. None retained their Calliope launchers. Those had been scrapped or stored, considered too specialized for general use, too limited in application to justify the logistics of maintaining them. The Sherman proved adaptable enough to serve for decades in various roles, but the Calliope was specific to a moment, a weapon born of particular circumstances that couldn't be replicated once those circumstances changed. Yet, in the mythology of World War II weapons, the Calliope holds a particular place. It wasn't the most effective tank. That honor belongs to the Soviet T-34 or German Panther depending on one's criteria. It wasn't the most produced weapon. Regular Shermans outnumbered Calliopes by factors of dozens. It wasn't the most feared. German soldiers reserved their deepest terror for Soviet artillery barrages and American air attacks. But the Calliope was the most distinctive, the most visually dramatic, the most cinematically memorable. Its silhouette was unique. Its sound was unforgettable. Its effect was spectacular. In an era of industrial warfare where individual weapons often became indistinguishable from their mass-produced siblings, the Calliope stood apart. It was art as well as engineering, theater as well as tactics, a weapon that understood that sometimes the performance matters as much as the result. The final Calliope engagement of World War II came in April 1945, somewhere in Bavaria as American forces pushed through fragmenting German resistance. A strong point holding up an advance, a call for special weapons, a single Sherman rolling forward with its distinctive launcher silhouetted against the spring sky. The crew prepared to fire, went through their checklist, elevated the launcher, pressed the switch. 60 rockets leaped skyward, their trails crossing and interweaving as they spread toward the target. The German position disappeared in smoke and fire. The engagement lasted seconds. When the smoke cleared, white flags were waving from the ruins. The crew removed their launcher that evening, bolted it onto a truck for transport back to depot, and returned to being just another tank crew in an army that no longer needed rocket artillery because the enemy had stopped fighting. The war ended 3 weeks later. The Calliopes were mothballed. The crews went home, and the sound, that impossible, unforgettable howl that had announced American fury and German doom, faded into memory and eventually silence. But not complete silence. Never complete silence. Because every veteran who heard it carried the echo forward. Every historian who studied it preserved its memory. Every weapons designer who built its descendants acknowledged its influence. The Calliope had roared for less than a year of combat, had fired its rockets in perhaps 100 engagements, had been operated by a few thousand men in an army of millions. But its voice had been loud enough to carry across decades, its legacy substantial enough to matter, its story compelling enough to remember. In the end, the Calliope represented something fundamental about human nature under stress, the drive to innovate, to adapt, to create solutions even when those solutions are instruments of destruction. It was born from desperation and genius in equal measure, engineered by men who understood that war rewards creativity as much as courage, operated by soldiers who learned to love and fear it simultaneously. It killed efficiently and died quietly, serving its purpose and then fading away when better tools emerged. But in its brief moment of relevance, in that year when its rockets sang over French fields and German forests, it was magnificent and terrible and utterly unforgettable. A machine that made thunder, an invention that became mythology, a weapon that transformed the very air into an announcement of American power and German defeat. The organ of terror, the river organ, the Calliope, 60 tubes singing the music of war, and in their song the promise that hope and horror, like all things human, can be engineered into steel and set loose upon the world.